Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening at the Mark Twain Library for another installment of our conversation series presented by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. I am Marianne Carmen, co-president of the League of Women Voters with Kim O'Reilly. In a moment, I'm going to let tonight's moderator introduce our guest speaker, but first, I'd like to tell you a little about the award-winning Conversations series and also a little bit about how to participate in tonight's program. Conversations is a series of lectures and events created in 2019 by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. Winner of the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service, Conversations strives to foster civic engagement and meaningful dialogue through reflection on our history, culture, and current factors shaping our community, nation, and democracy. Just a quick thank you to area leagues and libraries for their support of this series: Easton Public Library, Weston Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown C.H. Booth Library, Ridgefield Library, Woodbury Public Library, Simsbury Public Library, the League of Women Voters of Weston, the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield, the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, and the Western Connecticut State University Library. We are recording tonight's program, so the recording will be available to view next week on the library's YouTube channel. We have set aside time for questions at the end of the program, and you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We will try to get to as many as possible. We are also offering closed captioning. The buttons for both the Q&A and closed caption functions are located at the bottom of your screen. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our host for tonight's program. Dr. Daniel W. Barrett is a professor emeritus at the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University. A former resident of Reading, he graduated with a BA from Wesleyan University, earned his Ph.D. in social psychology from Arizona State University, and served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the editor of the forthcoming Social Influence, Key Debates and Contending Perspectives, and the author of Social Psychology, Core Concepts and Emergent Trends, as well as numerous publications. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Marianne. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations. I want to thank the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I was a proud member before I moved away from town, for organizing tonight's event. Tonight, I'm very excited to have the opportunity and the privilege to chat with Dr. Benjamin Hett. Dr. Hett earned a BA at the University of Alberta and a JD at the University of Toronto, and practiced litigation in Toronto for a while before deciding to go on and earn a PhD in history at Harvard. He taught at Harvard College and the Harvard Law School, and since 2003, has been at Hunter College in the CUNY Graduate Center. He's written 6 books so far, more along the way, including The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, winner of the 2019 Vine Award for History, named one of the year's best books by the Times of London and the Daily Telegraph. He also wrote The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War, which was named an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review, which is quite praiseworthy. And currently, he's working on a book on criminal profiling in Nazi Germany, which we hope to get to at the end of this session. I'll ask you to let us know what you're doing and how you're doing it. Anyway, Ben, thanks for speaking with me tonight. Your work.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really delighted to be with you.
Your work is a good fit for this conversation series because it helps to bring into proper focus events that are occurring in the U.S., in other democracies, or former democracies around the world. You know, in recent years, we've seen long-held norms related to democratic politics, civic trust, truth-telling, due process, voting rights, free speech, I can go on, but other important domains are being tossed out, just out in the garbage, just being ignored. And it's really whenever they are seen to interfere with a naked assertion of power by particular political interests. Some of what we're seeing in the U.S. and around the world, we've witnessed before. What happened in Germany in 1930 should provide a negative lesson that reveals what we need to do to avoid a similarly horrific and absolutely disastrous outcome. As you wrote, Ben, Nazi Germany is different, I'm going to quote, than all other regimes in human history, and that serious historians are unanimous in judging it a catastrophe with no redeeming features. Those are very, very important words to keep in mind. Ben, the expertise that you bring to bear on Germany and the contemporary United States is invaluable, and I'm sure our audience will greatly benefit from hearing from you tonight and, of course, from reading your books, I hope, down the road. So I have a series of questions for you. I suspect more than we'll have time to get to tonight. At around 8:30, I'm going to turn over to audience questions, and then around 9 o'clock or so, we'll wrap up. Let's spend the first part of our time talking about the core narrative regarding the loss of democracy in Germany, and then later on, we'll turn to the United States. So let's start with Germany and get some stuff there kind of clarified and so on. But before I do that, I want to ask you a more personal question as a historian. So what got you interested in studying Nazi Germany? I mean, I've watched the Netflix series Hitler and the Nazis, Elon Trial, which you're in quite a bit, and I've read lots of books, seen lots of depictions of the Holocaust and World War II. But they're so troubling that I can't always sleep at night after I've read these things or seen these things. So I'm just curious, given your total immersion in this Nazi era, how do you do it? How does it not affect you? And so why are you studying this? And so why does it not affect you the way at least it affects me?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. As a matter of fact, a brilliant editor I worked with on a couple of my books once said to me in exasperation, "Can't you find something cheerful to write about?" And I guess I can't. I think really, to be honest, the answer is I didn't plan my career very well. As you mentioned in the intro, I had a detour through the legal profession when I was young. I spent 4 years or so working as a litigation associate in a big corporate law firm, and I knew that I hated that, and wasn't quite sure what to do with my life, except I was reading a lot of history in my spare time just out of interest. And at some point, I had a kind of, my wife calls it my epiphany, that it occurred to me I should quit my job and go back to school and get a PhD and be a history professor. So that's what I did. And at first, actually, I had been reading a lot about Britain and World War I, which really fascinated me. And I thought that's what I wanted to kind of focus on. And then I needed to fill up my schedule in my first year of classes. And I was still a young man and I didn't want to get up early. And there was a class at 6 p.m. on Bismarckian Germany. And I thought, 6 p.m., great, I'm there. Uh, and then in that class really blew my mind. And I realized that, I mean, modern German history is basically a story of disasters. And disasters are kind of interesting. They're not fun to live through, but they're kind of interesting to read about. In those innocent, far-off days, I didn't think I might live through anything similar to that. But I just became fascinated with the turbulence, the ins and outs, the regime change, the ideological extremes, everything, the drama of 19th and 20th century German history. And I ended up drifting into that, and basically here I am. About 30 years or so after that, here I am, having spent 3 decades more or less studying and reading and writing about 20th century German history, which continues to completely fascinate me.
And you're still smiling after all these years.
Yes, indeed. It's probably says something important about me, but there it is.
So one of the aspects of your books that I particularly admire is how eminently readable they are. Each book, and indeed each chapter of each book, tells a story, an interesting and important story. While you don't shy away from detail when it's necessary, you don't get bogged down in irrelevant details or tangents or whatever. And you don't make the reader go through all that stuff either. I slog that either. I really appreciate that. History is a story or a series of stories, and you're really an expert history storyteller. Another aspect I like of your books is the insertion of the vignettes at the beginning of each chapter. There's a short story in italics for each book, for each chapter for each book, that introduces an important person or an event that happened, or maybe a new person or something you've talked about before, but you want to bring it back up again in some other perspective. And I found it to be very, very helpful in my reading. But let's go on and talk about actual history now. So it might be helpful to outline the major events that led to the destruction of democracy, in Germany. And before we get there, though, talk a little bit about what happened before that. So pre-Hitler, what was going on in Germany? So I know that Germany was unified around 1871 and had been so for several decades under Bismarck. But it was a constitutional monarchy. It was not a democracy. And then World War One hit badly, and then World War after that was done, we saw democracy emerge. So, if you could talk a little bit about that process and how we got there, and also once democracy was created after World War One, how popular was it? Did Germans actually want this kind of government, and so on?
Yeah, great. You've already done a great job of laying this out. I guess I'll start with this. The Germany that was created in 1871, as you said, a constitutional monarchy which endured until it was defeated in World War One and fell in 1918, that was a really weird hybrid regime. It's true that it was not exactly a democracy, but it was kind of I mean, it had strong democratic elements, actually. It was a kind of weird hybrid regime. Um, uh, it had an elected parliament that had significant powers, particularly control of the budget. The right to vote was quite broad by the standards of the day. Women couldn't vote, but that was still quite typical at the time. But all adult men could vote, which actually in some ways made it more democratic than Great Britain at that time, where the franchise was still tied to taxes and property in various complicated ways. Um, the thing is that the executive branch, if you will, um, was basically the Kaiser or the emperor and his administration. And you got to be emperor because your dad was emperor, basically. And then the Kaiser would pick cabinet secretaries, and they're responsible only to him. So the Constitution was actually, it's like the United States if the presidency wasn't elected. If the presidency was a hereditary office, then that would look a lot like the Constitution of what we call Imperial Germany. And the thing I want to stress there is that because of the democratic parliament, there was a really vigorous political culture, like in a sense, a democratic political culture. There were political parties that were well organized and campaigned aggressively in elections. And the long-term trend line in German politics from 1871 to World War One was sort of towards the left and towards democracy. The party that was really gaining support in the couple decades before World War One was the Social Democratic Party, which was left of center, sort of mildly socialist, kind of like, democratic socialist today, kind of like, Bernie or somebody like that. Um, in 1912, the last election before World War One, the Social Democrats came out as the biggest party. They were the most successful. So and that's important sort of background to what happens later in the 1920s and 1930s. There is a sense in which Germany was a very sophisticated, sort of quasi-democracy with actually very high turnout rates in elections too. The turnout rates in elections were sort of 85 to 90% of eligible voters. We don't, of course, don't see anything like that in America today, and most democracies don't. So that's what Germany is going into World War One. And then, of course, as you noted, World War One goes, very badly for Germany. Spoiler alert there. It goes down to defeat after 4 years of real suffering, of considerable hunger among the people because of the British Navy blockading and cutting off food imports. Of very high casualties. Germany lost about 1.7 million soldiers killed in action in World War One out of a population of around 65 million. Footnote there, I like to make the point to my students that imagine a war, if we had a war now in the United States and had that sort of rate of fatal casualties, it would be, 8 million or so. So imagine if we had a war right now and had 8 million soldiers killed. Think what that would do to the society. So this is what Germany's facing by the end of World War One. And then to top it all off, the war had made the regime unpopular, the Kaiser's regime. At the end of the war, there was basically a revolution and a regime change to a democracy which was guided by the Social Democrats as the biggest party. And that happens right at the same time as the end of the war in November 1918. So Germany is going into the peace with, a defeat and a new regime. The Social Democrats turned to the task of drafting a constitution for this new regime. Meanwhile, they have to fight off political challenges from the far left and the far right. The people who are basically about to become the communists don't accept the Social Democrats in power, and they kind of launch an uprising, which the Social Democrats are obliged to put down, using military support basically drawn from the far right. And the far right doesn't like the social democratic regime either. So there's a lot of bitterness and anger all around. And this right off the bat kind of creates a legacy of complicated patterns of hatred. You know, right and center left hating each other, center left hating far left, and far left hating center left. And so that's the kind of, historians say that's the kind of mortgage that Germany starts into the peacetime era and into the democratic era. Then they do draft a new constitution, which creates a full-on democracy and a highly progressive one by the standards of the day. It is sometimes said that the constitution of what became known as the Weimar Republic, because the constitution was drafted in the city of Weimar, basically. The constitution of the Weimar Republic was a professor's dream. And somehow when people say that, they don't mean it as a good thing. I know you'll agree with me that I don't understand why a professor's dream is a bad thing,
Of course,
but
right.
apparently it is. Um, uh, what they really mean by that is it was, really sort of nice in theory and not necessarily so nice in practice. So I'll just quickly give you two examples. It created a system of complete proportional representation. Some viewers may be familiar with this. It's a common system in Europe to this day. Basically, it means there's a straight flow through from popular vote to outcome in terms of how many seats each party gets. And the way you would vote in an election is you wouldn't vote for a local candidate for your district or anything. You would just vote for a party. And the parties would have ranked party lists. And then whatever share of the popular vote they get, that's how many of their people get seats in the parliament, or as it was called, the Reichstag. Um, so what this tends to do is create a system with a lot of parties, none of which gets a particularly big share of the vote. So it can be a formula for political instability and political infighting, and that was the case in Germany in the 20s and early 30s. The other thing is the Constitution created a provision for emergency powers that were in the hands of the elected president of the Republic. Um, and basically, famously, Article 48 of the Constitution allowed the president to do just about anything by basically executive order if the president deemed it to be an emergency. And by everything, I say they could do anything by order, including expressly overriding all the individual rights and freedoms that were contained in the Constitution. So Article 48 contained the potential to create a dictatorship in the hands of the president of the Reich. The people who drafted this constitution um, assumed that only a Democrat, like small d Democrat, would get elected to be president of a democratic republic. It was a bit of a blind spot that it didn't occur to them that an anti-democratic person could win an election to the presidency of a democracy. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., famous justice, famously said, "You need to draft laws for the bad man, not the good man. I mean, the good man will do what he needs to do anyway, but you need to contain the bad man." And the framers of the Weimar Constitution didn't think enough about that. They didn't think about laws to contain the bad man. So the sort of combination of these things, of the proportional representation system and the powers of Article 48, created potential real trouble if voters voted for someone who was not a supporter of the democracy. So that's kind of like to sort of foreshadow what's going to come.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So yeah, let's jump ahead then to start talking about what happens, 15 or so years later, in 1933. And so what led to, as you call it, the death of democracy in Germany? I think that Timothy Ryback counted 53 days all took Hitler to dismantle the democracy. But I think you have it down to 30 days, if I counted the days correctly. So if this weren't actually true, I wouldn't believe it, right? If this hadn't actually happened, it's hard to believe.
One of the great books about this is by a great Yale historian, the late Henry Turner. His book was entitled Hitler's 30 Days to Power. And that's basically January 1933. I would put it a little longer. I would say it's about 5 years. The real process of the decay of democracy is about 5 years. And the starting point here is really actually that by the late 20s, Germany is doing really quite well. The democracy has kind of solidified, despite its earlier, the earlier challenges I mentioned of the various complicated political hatreds and violence of the first few years. And despite, everybody I think is familiar with this, the notorious hyperinflation of the early 1920s, when the German currency, the mark, at the worst point was trading at 4.3 trillion to the US dollar. Quite mind-boggling, really.
Yeah.
Um, and despite all of that, Germany kind of recovered, and the second half of the 1920s were actually pretty good years. Economically, Germany got back to, by all sort of economic statistics, where it had been before World War One. And in the 1928 elections, the core Democratic parties, the Social Democrats, and also a couple of other parties that were kind of allied with the Social Democrats, they did very well in the elections and they formed an administration with a solid Democratic majority in the Reichstag. So things were going pretty well. And actually, it was things going pretty well that sort of kicked off a process that made things go south because by 1928, powerful interests, most especially big business and the military, are starting to think this democracy isn't working for us. It's not working for big business because the new system, being sort of social democrat oriented, had introduced, for instance, comprehensive welfare legislation. They had nationally mandated wage arbitration systems for larger business enterprises, which had put wages way up. And business didn't like that. The military was frustrated because the kind of left of center leaning parliament wouldn't vote for military expenditures. And sort of famously in 1929, they refused to vote for a battleship. And the military sort of threw up its collective hands and said, we got to get rid of this democracy. So you get an alliance starting to form between these groups who start to think very carefully about how can we basically overturn the democracy and move it back to an authoritarian system, which will be better for the interests of the military and big business. So this is happening at a very elite level. Meanwhile, the Great Depression hits. And of course, the Great Depression is a disaster everywhere. Uh, Germany is hit harder by any statistical measure than any country except for the United States, which by any statistical measure was hit the hardest by the Great Depression in terms of unemployment and drop in manufacturing production and so on. But Germany's kind of number two. Just to give you an idea, by 1932, the official unemployment rate was 40% in Germany. So the degree of suffering is getting quite bad in 1929, 1930, 1931. And along comes a political party that had previously been nowhere, that basically positions itself as the party that will speak for Germans against what they see as this global order, which is bringing Germany down economically. Nobody used the word globalization back in 1929 or 1930, but this political party that I'm talking about probably won't surprise you if I say it's what we call the Nazi Party. And how the Nazi Party really breaks through politically is, to put it in terms that we would use, by being nationalist spokespeople against economic globalization, to which Germans tend to attribute their economic woes. Not entirely wrongly, by the way, to attribute their woes to that, but nonetheless, it's the Nazis who are profiting by this. And so the Nazis go from absolutely nowhere politically. In that 1928 election I mentioned, they got just over 2% of the vote. 2 years later, there's another Reichstag election in 1930, and the Nazis leap up to just over 18%, which makes them the second biggest party after the Social Democrats. So now something's really in play, that this group is harnessing popular anger with the economic conditions with a sort of weird message that is somewhat right-wing, but also populist. Actually, I mean, more than somewhat right-wing, very right-wing, but also very populist. Um, and they're a very different stream from the elite business and military leaders who want to overturn the democracy for their own reasons. But to sort of make a really long, complicated story somewhat short, the overarching narrative of German politics, I would say from 1930 to 1933, is a narrative of these two groups sort of trying to dance with each other. The elite business and military leaders look at Hitler and his party, and they don't like them because they're crude and demagogic and they're kind of extreme in some ways. And some of their rhetoric is kind of dangerously, from the standpoint of business, dangerously anti-capitalist and dangerously egalitarian. But the Nazis are clearly anti-communist. They make that very clear. They're clearly pro-military. And those two things make them attractive to the conventional mainstream right. And so the conventional mainstream right is trying to figure out a way to harness this movement and this leader who seems to have an ability with his speaking to rally people, which the conventional right doesn't have. They're trying to find a way to harness this movement and get the support behind them while they maintain power for themselves. Meanwhile, Hitler is trying to use these elite people to open the doors to power for him because he needs them to do that. And they basically go around and around and around this for 3 years until basically in January 1933, they make a deal. And the sort of mainstream right adopts Hitler, opens the door to power for him, arranges for him to be the chancellor, the head of the cabinet, the head of the government. And this is what happens on the 30th of January, 1933. So Hitler now has been brought in the door.
Right, right. Um, so at Hindenburg, who was the president then, didn't like Hitler at all, right? He kind of detested the guy, didn't want him in the cabinet, didn't want to appoint him as the chancellor, but did so anyway, just maybe despite his, I don't know, better thoughts or intuitions or what have you. One of the things that you talk about in your book, one of the myths that you say that other people perpetrate is that Hindenburg had no choice. He had no choice but to appoint Hitler. And you say actually there was a choice. And so can you talk a little bit more as to what options Hindenburg had and why
Sure.
did he ultimately choose to pick this guy? And I know that he and other folks believe they could control Hitler, that they would put him in, they wouldn't give him any power, they could control him and kick him out if need be. But obviously that's not what happened. So why did Hindenburg pick him, and what were the consequences?
Yeah, Hindenburg in some ways, so he had been elected president of the Reich, president of Germany in 1925, and then re-elected in 1932. It was a 7-year term. And the Constitution gave the president the right to appoint a chancellor and a cabinet. So that's the mechanism by which Hitler could come into government by being appointed by Hindenburg. But as you say, Hindenburg had no use for Hitler at all. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, Hitler was from Austria. Hindenburg was a Prussian. And Austrians and Prussians have never liked each other, and they still don't. I can assure you. My wife has German relatives who are from the south of Germany, and they can't stand people from the north. Um, uh, and then there's a social class thing. Hindenburg was Paul von Hindenburg, and actually there's about 10 other names there, which I can't remember. Aristocratic Germans tend to have a lot of middle names. Uh, but he was from a very aristocratic family. Hitler was from a very humble background, so there's sort of social contempt. And then in World War I, Hindenburg had been a field marshal and he had been commander in chief of the German army. Uh, Hitler had served in World War I famously, but he hadn't made it past the German rank of Gefreiter, which translates roughly as private first class.
Yeah,
So Hindenburg,
didn't Hindenburg call him the little private?
yes, well, the Bohemian private. Hindenburg didn't quite understand where Hitler was from. He sort of thought he was from Bohemia. For a Prussian like Hindenburg, somewhere out there in the south where Catholics live. That's how, a Prussian Lutheran is going to think about it. As far as Hindenburg is concerned, it's bad either way. So yeah, so he referred to Hitler contemptuously as that Bohemian private. And on two occasions when Hitler's party won parliamentary elections in July and in November 1932, constitutionally, Hindenburg sort of should have named Hitler to be chancellor, but he didn't. And both times he met with Hitler, and we have records of what he said, and it's almost cute if the stakes weren't so serious, what Hindenburg said, but he wasn't wrong. He said to Hitler, basically, I can't reconcile it with my conscience to name someone like you to be chancellor when you lead a party that is so biased against its opponents. I mean, biased against opponents is a pretty gentle way to put what Hitler was. I mean, this is at a
Right.
time when his stormtroopers are literally out beating up and killing people from other parties on the streets of German cities. So yes, he is biased against his opponents. But Hindenburg sort of got the idea. I mean, you got to hand it to him. He's putting it in a funny way, but he sort of got the idea, and he doesn't want this, Bohemian private to be chancellor. And that's still true in January 1933. And he's still saying, we have records of Hindenburg saying to people right up to, about January 21st or so, no, I'm never making that man my chancellor. He's fit at best to be my postal minister, he said to one person. And then suddenly he turns on a dime and he offers Hitler the chancellorship. And that's one of those mysteries that historians kind of probe and play around with. I personally have a theory that I sort of articulate in my book. I can't say this is 100% proven, but there is evidence pointing to the fact that the German Constitution contained an impeachment provision for the president, much like in the United States. And it seems that the Nazis were threatening Hindenburg with impeachment, and there were a couple of grounds on which he could conceivably be impeached. Um, for instance, he had done a kind of shady tax thing with his house, and that could be grounds for impeachment. And it seems that that threat started to, penetrate Hindenburg's rather thick skull, and he may have given in to the threat. I mean, there were some other factors too. There was a real deadlock in German politics, and there were only really a couple of ways out. And one way out was really to suspend the Constitution and to keep a non-Nazi administration going with the emergency powers in defiance of the Constitution. That was one option Hindenburg did have. And the other was to name Hitler, basically. And he picked the name Hitler option. He might have just thought that's a better option than defying the Constitution. But I do think there is some evidence that he was worried about this impeachment threat and the very speed with which he changed his mind. I mean, it's within a couple of days in January 1933.
Right.
He changed his mind and names Hitler. I sort of think that points to the impeachment threat.
So let's move up to February 25th, I think it was, which was the Reichstag fire. And I know you wrote an entire book about this fire, and for good reason. It's a fascinating read. But just if you could just quickly tell us, so the fire happened in the parliament. There's some one man was identified as being in the fire, in the building at that time, and Hitler right away said, "These are the communists," right? He started talking about who he thought was the perpetrators.
Yep.
And that led to the decree 2 days later, the Reichstag decree, which had some pretty horrible consequences and basically stopped all civil rights and freedom of speech and gave the chancellor all kinds of powers that he didn't have prior to that. So you can't summarize your whole book in 1 minute because you wrote so much and it's so fast. But just quickly, tell us, why is it so important to know who started that fire? Because there was a big mystery, right? We know that Hitler thought one thing, but historians have had different theories over the years. And you have your own theory, and you provide some pretty compelling evidence for who you think started it and why. But if you could just quickly summarize that, and why was this fire and the aftermath of the fire so critical to what happened in Germany over the next, 14, 13 years?
Yeah. So, uh, I mean, obviously, I'm quite fascinated by the Reichstag fire. The sort of quick version here. Let me say what is clear and important and uncontroversial, and then I'll say a quick word about the controversy. So, clear and important and not controversial, as you said, is that so the fire happens on the evening of February 27th. In the wee hours of February 28th, Hitler uses that Article 48 of the Constitution that I mentioned to pass an emergency order, gets Hindenburg to agree to it, which basically guts the Constitution. It puts an end to all individual rights and freedoms. And very importantly, it gives Hitler's national government the ability to take over any of the federal state governments. Germany then and now is a federation like the United States. So it really creates the basis for Hitler to be a dictator. So that's the most important thing about it. And Hitler justified this by saying it's the communists who set fire to the Reichstag building, the parliament building. This is the start of their coup d'etat against my government, so we have to crack down. And starting that night, they started arresting political opponents, and over the next day or so, they arrested about 5,000 people they deemed to be opponents of the Nazis. And basically, very bad things happened to those people. That part's clear. It's also clear, as you mentioned, that there's one guy who was clearly running around the building and was arrested and clearly had something to do with the fire. He was a 24-year-old Dutch journeyman stonemason named Marinus van der Lubbe. Van der Lubbe was, I think it's fair to say, somewhat mentally handicapped, and he was about 80% vision impaired. The question then and now is, did van der Lubbe, it's kind of like the Kennedy assassination of German history, I always say. The question is, did van der Lubbe act alone, or was he a stooge in someone else's conspiracy? That's the debate. And of course, the Nazis at the time said he's a stooge in a communist conspiracy. anyone in 1933 who wasn't a Nazi pretty much went right to the conclusion he's a stooge in a Nazi conspiracy because you ask classically in criminal matters who benefits. And it's the Nazis who benefit by being able to pass this decree. So it makes sense that they put this guy up to it somehow to burn the building. And, hence they can say, oh gosh, look, it's the communists. We need this emergency decree. That debate has gone on from that day to this, and it will probably always go on. Let me see, about 12 years ago, I published a book on this after years of research, and I made the argument it was a Nazi false flag operation. Um, uh, and this basically relies on two main points of evidence. One is there is evidence, basically unanimous evidence from any scientist who knows about fire and how fire behaves in a building. Anyone who has looked at this from 1933 to the 21st century has concluded that it was just not possible for van der Lubbe to set the fire that destroyed the center of the building by himself with the time and tools that he had at his disposal. Because we know pretty clearly when he got into the building and when he was arrested, and we know pretty clearly what he had with him in terms of gear. And there's just no possible way he could have set the fire that destroyed the main chamber of the building. So that's pretty clear. Then there is evidence from some Nazi police officials after the war who testified at Nuremberg or who were around at Nuremberg, and they gave evidence saying uh, it was burned by a bunch of Nazi stormtroopers. The stormtroopers were led by this one character named Hans-Georg Gewehr, who was an important stormtrooper leader in Berlin. And interestingly, Gewehr was unusually bright for a Nazi. He was a trained engineer, university trained engineer. And he actually gave training courses for stormtroopers before 1933 on how to set things on fire with phosphorus. So several, including several Nazis, including the head of the Gestapo, the head of the secret police in 1933, said in 1946, 1947, it was that guy. It was Hans-Georg Gewehr. So everybody knew that inside in Nazi circles. It's clearly him. You should find him and talk to him. The Allied prosecutors in Nuremberg said you should find him and talk to him. So basically, that's what I think happened. In fairness to viewers, this remains controversial. The distinguished British historian Sir Richard Evans has written a lot saying I'm completely insane to make this argument. And there's been Professor Evans and I have been in something of a debate for the last dozen years on this point. So, viewers can, if they want, look into this and come to their own conclusions. I personally think the evidence is pretty clear, but no one needs to agree with me.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. And the book is fascinating, by the way. So if you haven't read it, folks out there, it's a great read.
Thank
It's
you.
amazing how much you can talk. You could talk about one fire. You can have a whole book about it, and also the consequences of that fire. But it's fascinating read. So in chapter 2 of that saying of the other book, actually on death of democracy, you call the chapter "Don't Believe Him, He's Telling the Truth." And while on the face of it, that sounds paradoxical, it in fact isn't. It isn't the case. And the opening vignette for that chapter is a trial in May 1931, which is well before Hitler became chancellor. And he was called on to testify about some murders that happened, stormtroopers that were involved in killing some people. Hitler was an intrepid liar, you know, but yet he was quite clear then and in other avenues what he wanted to do once if he became president, prime minister, I mean whatever, in charge of the nation. So can you unravel for us this paradox that here's the guy that everybody knows he's lying all the time, but yet people still want to believe what he has to say. So don't believe him, but yet because he's lying, but yet he's telling the truth. And so how do you unpack that paradox? And of course, we see the same thing in today's America with somebody doing very similar things, lying and lying, lying, but yet telling other things that are so abhorrently true or so abhorrent we don't want them to be true, but are in fact true. So just with respect to Hitler, how do you unpack that paradox?
Yeah, so that chapter title actually is a quote from a distinguished lawyer in Berlin at the time named Rudolf Olden, one of the people in that time and place who I really admire. Uh, and among other things, in addition to being a lawyer, Olden often wrote basically op-ed pieces for the newspaper that was sort of Berlin's equivalent of the New York Times at that time. And that was his characterization of the way Hitler handled a particular issue, which came up in that trial you alluded to. Which basically I wrote a whole other book about. I wrote about the lawyer who subpoenaed Hitler to that trial.
Yeah, I haven't read that
Um,
one yet, but I'd like to.
um, the lawyer was a young man named Hans Litten, who might actually be the historical figure I most admire, an incredible, brave, brilliant young man who, because of Hitler, died very young. But anyway, um, Hitler was playing a very complicated game with both violence and legality. And this is what Olden was pointing to with this quote. Hitler, on the one hand, would tell his stormtroopers, whose job was basically to go out and beat up people from other political parties. He would sort of encourage them to do this and say, yes, commit violence. We're going to overthrow the state with violence. You're the ones who are going to do it. Go kill me some communists, basically. But at the same time, he's attracting kind of middle class voters by saying, no, we're going to follow the Constitution. We're going to do everything completely legally. We'll come to power legally. Then he would usually say, when we come to power, heads will roll in the sand. Like he literally said that. When we come to power, heads will roll in the sand, but we'll come to power legally. And the problem was the two wings of the Nazi support base, the stormtrooper, violent wing, and the kind of middle class, let's be constitutional wing. I mean, those things are irreconcilable, and Hitler's messages to them were irreconcilable. And what Olden was trying to say there was Hitler was going to sell out his stormtroopers and kind of go with the middle class people. And so what he's basically saying his words were sort of addressed to the stormtroopers when he says, don't believe him, he's telling the truth. In other words, kind of he's going to sell you out. He's telling the truth about how he's going to come to power. Which is basically what happened. When he came to power, he sold out the stormtroopers. He had a lot of them killed because they had become an inconvenience to him by that time.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a broader point, and you were kind of alluding to it, I think, on the lead-in. An interesting thing about Hitler, I think, is that he did lie all the time. And he was, in a sense, quite upfront about this. I mean, he wrote a really fascinating passage in his book, Mein Kampf, about lying in politics and how it's a good idea, except you got to tell really big lies. Don't tell
The big
little
lies, right?
lies.
The
Because
bigger the
people won't
better,
do
right?
it. Tell a whopper because most people will think, well, gosh, that's a whopper. That must be true because who would tell a lie that big if it weren't true? And, Hitler was actually very astute about this kind of stuff. So, in a funny way, although he lied all the time, what you saw was what you got with Hitler. I mean, what you got was this demagogic politician who lied all the time and kind of said, yeah, I lie all the time. And, we may get to this. There are some parallels to more recent political leaders in that regard, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. So another paradox about Hitler, which you write about in your books, is that Hitler was a guy who didn't really have any friends, didn't have any romantic intimacies that were substantive, didn't have close relationships, but yet he had this incredible, I think, in your words, a remarkable intuition for the thoughts, hopes, fears, and needs of other people. So here's this guy who didn't seem to know anybody, no one knew him well, but yet he had some insight into what drives people, and which, clearly was a major factor in how he became so popular and so well liked, at least for a time, in Hitler. I mean, in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a very weird thing. I think historians, by and large, who work on this stuff, because we know Hitler was so evil, I think we tend as a group to be reluctant to attribute any ability to him. I mean, there's a real tendency for historians to say, this guy was nothing. He had nothing going on. He had no abilities. He just kind of got lifted into the job and, didn't do it very well. I actually think that's not true. And I believe in history, we need to kind of look things in the eye. And sometimes very evil people have talents. And Hitler had talents. I believe if he hadn't had those talents, he wouldn't have got where he got because he didn't start with any advantages. And his maybe outstanding talent was his ability to read people, of which there is abundant evidence that he was extremely acute at that. He was extremely good at reading people, both on a kind of one-on-one level. If you were having a conversation with him, he would suss out pretty quickly where you were coming from and what you wanted to hear and what he could say to make you respect or like him. And that also worked in groups. And again, there's abundant evidence of this, that he could walk into a room where he was speaking or walk into a hall where he's giving a big speech and he could kind of read the crowd. And indeed, in his first few moments in speaking, you could sort of see him reading the crowd, sort of putting out words as feelers and sort of seeing what they respond to. And then he would lock into it, he would get it, and then he would start going in a particular direction, and the crowd would go nuts. He had a remarkable ability that way. And combined with that ability to read people, he also had a considerable acting talent. He could be different things at different times. He could seem sane and rational if he wanted to be persuasive to a sort of sophisticated statesman or something. Or he could be the ranting guy, at a rally that we've all seen in many film clips. Um, and as you said, it's sort of weird, I think, that he had this intuition, given that he was so closed off from most people. He had very few close friends. One of his closest friends was the stormtrooper leader Ernst Röhm, whom he had murdered in 1934. So that's what being a close friend of Hitler got you. He was quite close to his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who was one of the smartest people around him, and I suspect that had something to do with the closeness. He had no romantic relationships really, except for the long and secret one with his mistress, Eva Braun. But even that was a sort of, by all evidence, it wasn't a particularly emotionally intimate relationship. Some historians say the only person he clearly loved was his mother, and she died when he was quite young. So to me, it's a puzzle that someone who seems so closed off from other human beings yet had this remarkable intuition and this ability to reach and move people.
Yeah, I think it's Ian Kershaw talks about the cult of personality of Hitler, and that without Hitler, the Nazis would have been nothing. They really were. I mean, he wasn't the only Nazi, obviously, but without him, that party would never have had any successes in Germany. And that seems to be what
Yeah.
most historians are saying about Hitler and about that time of German history. So let me talk, kind of transition a little bit to the United States, but I'm going to do it in the reverse way first, which is to talk about the way in which the Germans used the Jim Crow laws in America as models for their own Nuremberg laws. A lot of Americans don't realize that Hitler actually used America as a model for a while. In fact, James Q. Whitman wrote a book on this called Hitler's American Model, in deciding what he could and could not do. And in fact, he thought we had gone too far in the Jim Crow laws, and we had done too many horrible things to, African Americans, and restricted their rights in too many ways, and et cetera, that we were too extreme for Hitler, for at least for a time. So can you just tell us a little bit about how Hitler used America as a model for some of his how he ran the government?
Yeah. I mean, there are sort of two things there. One is laws involving segregation. So as you're referring to Jim Crow laws, um, the Nazis thought about that when they were trying to frame laws to basically segregate Jews from German society. But as you say, quite correctly, the Nazis actually thought the Jim Crow laws on the whole were too extreme. So in particular, a feature of a lot of Jim Crow laws was the one drop rule. If you have one drop of like African American blood, you're considered African American, and you're subject to the laws that affect African Americans. The Nazis thought that was too extreme. And so their version is something called the Nuremberg laws to define who was Jewish and who wasn't. And there, for instance, if you had, say, they would do it by grandparent. If you had two Jewish grandparents but two non-Jewish grandparents, or if you had, one Jewish grandparent and three non-Jewish grandparents, you were kind of okay. You were what they would call a Mischling, or a person of mixed blood or mixed race. And if you were in that category, you could sort of get through Nazi Germany maybe okay. There were lots of people categorized that way who were not, deported to camps or anything like that. The American laws which Hitler more directly admired actually were the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, because he admired the racial categorization in those acts. These are kind of obscure now. I don't know how many of your viewers might be familiar with this. There's a really good book came out a few years ago called The Guarded Gate by Daniel Okrent. He used to be the public editor with the New York Times, which I thought was really fascinating on these laws. Basically, particularly the 1924 laws, known as the Johnson Act, established quotas for who could come into the United States, and the quotas were heavily weighted towards Northern and Western Europe. Like, there were quite large quotas for, the UK or Germany. The point of the laws was to exclude Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, partly because they were often thought to be Jews or Southern Europeans, because there was a lot of prejudice against Italians and people like that, and completely exclude Asians and Africans and anyone deemed to be non-white. And so Hitler thought, and the Nazis thought, this is a great model of sort of how to create the sort of racial state that you want to create by attracting, Northern and Western Europeans and screening out everybody else, in particular screening out Jews. So the Nazis, and Hitler actually talked about this very expressly in Mein Kampf. He had a lot of admiration for those laws.
So let's move ahead a little bit then. I know it's already at 8:20, so I want to move on to the more contemporary times in the United States. And in the Democracy, which you wrote around 2017, it was published in 2018, and you mentioned that time in Germany, the 1930s, resembled, at that point, the United States in 2017, 2018. I'm wondering, now we're in the 2020s. So things have gone even further, I think, in that direction. But I wanted to ask you I could start listing things that I've seen, but I wanted to ask you as a historian to speak about what did you mean by that? How is it that we resemble what happened in the 1930s, and have we gone even more in that resembling direction, in a sense, more extreme in some of those same political behaviors and movements and so forth?
I should just start by saying, and this was largely at the urging of my editor for that book. Um, in the book, I didn't actually expressly say that. The book has no express comparisons to the United States. It is very much between the lines. Uh, so between the
You're right.
lines,
I was reading between the lines.
yeah, no, and
Yes, I was. Yeah.
I mean, you're not wrong, and I think
Mhm.
it's interesting. No one who has read the book has missed the point, like ever, I think. Um, between the lines, I wanted to sort of point to particularly something we were talking about a few minutes ago, the alliance between what you might call kind of mainstream establishment conservatives and Hitler's kind of radical insurgency, because the mainstream conservatives thought, well, we're not getting anywhere electorally, but this will float our boat and we can use this person and we can manipulate him. And in fact, they find out, that the servant becomes the master, so to speak, and Hitler turns the tables on them. And that was the thing I was worried about for America in, you're quite correct, 2017. I was writing that book just when Trump came in the first time. Not coincidentally, I was writing that book when Trump came in the first time. Um, and so, yes, things have gone farther. The thing I was worried about happening, I think, has happened. That though not as dramatically as in Germany in the 30s, the extremists have taken over the Republican Party, and I believe we don't really have a conservative party anymore in this country. We have a party that is really Trump's party now. It's really MAGA, which means it has, on the whole, I think, at best, a very qualified relationship to democracy. Um, that said, in some ways, where we are now in 2026, um, Trump has obviously gone much farther with some things than he did in his first term, because basically he has no one around him to tell him you can't do this as he did in his first term. And which is why I think we've seen things like what ICE has done in some American cities, why we're seeing, what we're seeing right now with the war in Iran, or what he did with Venezuela, or to me, maybe most shocking, the threats against Greenland and Canada. I mean, I grew up in Canada, so that one gets me a little personally.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I also think, especially given the venue where we're at here, I often quote the perhaps apocryphal but attributed to Mark Twain statement, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I think we do have some rhymes going on here. I think Trump, left to his own devices, would want very much to emulate some of what Hitler did in terms of suppressing a free press, having all power concentrated in his hands, having something like ICE to, deliver the sharp end to protesters. But I think very importantly is not Germany in 1933. And I think there are sort of cultural reserves of democratic feeling and of individualism, which are keeping Trump from succeeding. And one thing I think has been the rather encouraging lesson of the past year is how much pushback we've seen from Americans to some of what Trump has tried to do to take us in an authoritarian direction. I don't
That
know
was
quite.
one of the questions I wanted to ask you about was the
Okay.
resistance in Germany to Hitler. I know there were a few attempts to kill him, but other than that, how much resistance was there in Germany? And then I was going to ask that, for the first parallels here in the United States, where we had these No Kings Days, we had another one coming up in a few days here, and a week or so here. And so there is a difference in that sense between what's going on now and what we saw in the 30s. And so if you could talk about the resistance to Hitler and then compare that to the resistance to Trump, that'd be terrific.
Um, there certainly was resistance to Hitler. The attempts to kill him are famous, and those came generally from very elite people, as only they could. I mean, basically, you would have to be in a powerful position to have access to him to kill him. And the people who were in that position were mostly senior military leaders and a few sort of senior civilian political leaders, which led to, for instance, the famous Valkyrie plot of 1944, but also less well known, a number of assassination attempts before that, all of which obviously failed, but basically carried out by these elite uh, people. There was mass resistance, mostly from people who were communists. There were about a couple 100,000 communist activists who spent at least some amount of time in a concentration camp for resistance activity. That's by far the biggest group numerically of Germans who tried to push back against the regime. And then here and there was resistance from especially people in various religious organizations or resistance on the basis of religious faith. One thing historians generally say, and I think it seems to me to be true, is that the cost of resistance was very high. I mean, this was a government that didn't mess around. If you were engaging in resistance, you were likely to be speedily arrested, probably speedily tortured, and speedily executed. Um, so someone who's willing to take that on is going to be someone who has a really intense faith in something else. And it tended to be communists who had an intense faith in a different politics, or it tended to be people of religious faith who had an intense faith in a different moral order, who were willing to take the risks and make the sacrifices. Obviously, no resistance succeeded, and no resistance really, certainly no mass resistance, no public mass resistance was possible in a regime like Nazi Germany quite quickly. I mean, basically after the Reichstag fire, no public resistance was possible at all. So that's, just to emphasize, that's 4 weeks into to Hitler's time in power, that no resistance, no public resistance is possible. So, that's why I tend to tell people that I think too close parallels between what we have right now and what Germany had in 1933 are a bit overwrought because, here we are, Dan, having this conversation in, what are we, month 14 or 15 or so of Trump's time. And I think it's
Mhm.
unlikely that either of us is going to get shot as soon as we're done having this conversation. So, and we've seen what happened in Minneapolis, the pushback from people there, or similar things in Los Angeles and Chicago in response to ICE. We've seen what the courts have done in stopping a lot of what Trump has tried to do. Um, I think we're starting to see a few signs of disaffection within the MAGA coalition, particularly with regard to the war in Iran, like that guy, the terrorism expert who stepped down the other day. And
Mhm.
there's others like him. There's, MAGA influencers who are similarly disenchanted. How far that will go, I don't know. But that's something which, in a way, I think is healthy. And it's very different from Germany in 1933 or 1934.
Yeah, we also have a different constitution. And for one thing, our parliament, our Congress cannot change the constitution by itself the way the Reichstag could change it in Germany.
Yeah,
And they can ignore it. In fact, they've done that a little bit.
they're doing
And
quite well at that, actually. Yes.
yes, they're pretty good at doing that, unfortunately. And they aren't able to give up their power the way the Reichstag did with Hitler. Basically, the Enabling Act gave up all their power. Essentially, maybe you could clarify exactly what that was for our viewers, but we can't do that here in our Congress, even though they sort of tried that with the tariffs and gave up their control of tariffs. And the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot do that. This is part of the legislative branch, not the executive branch.
Yeah.
So I see that as a pretty big difference as well. Again, it can be ignored, but it can't be changed in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one that really gets me is the Constitution is just crystal clear that it's Congress that declares war. And here we have a war, in which Congress, at least the Republican majority in Congress, is like, no, 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 we don't want anything to do with it. No, no, like they're just absolutely abdicating their power even more drastically than I think they did over tariffs, and it was pretty drastic over tariffs. So, I mean, that's not a positive, but at the same time, nothing can make what Trump is doing popular, and it's not. I mean, the polls speak pretty clearly, I think, as to how this show is going over with the American people. I mean, the interesting question will be what happens with the midterms in a few months from now. By all indications, this should be a really good year for the Democrats in the midterms if there are free and fair elections. And
Right.
unfortunately, I think that is a bit of an if. We'll see.
It's a pretty big if
Yeah.
from where I sit right now. Um, so another parallel between Germany in the 30s and the United States today is the presence or influence of the legal scholar Carl Schmitt.
Mhm.
So Schmidt, I believe, joined the Nazi Party in 1933, sort of after things already went sour for some of us, and he knew that, and that's why he joined the party, because he actually appreciated and wanted things to go in the direction they were going at that time. And Schmidt, who was forgotten for a long time in Western political theory, it seems, now has become kind of a hot item, at least among the people on the right in this country and maybe other parts of the world. And so, just tell us a little bit about Carl Schmitt as a German legal um, scholar and advisor to the Nazis. In fact, he was an ideologue. So he was more than just an advisor. He was actually doing stuff that was bad itself. And why is he why is he popular again?
So Carl Schmitt was a brilliant legal scholar, um, very right-wing Catholic. He got going in his career a couple years before World War One. He started writing, even at that time, very interesting jurisprudential pieces. He was, without trying to get too the ex-lawyer in me coming out here, without trying to get too legal technical, he's what we call an anti-positivist theorist. In other words, he's someone who's not that interested in what an actual legal text might say and require. He's interested in like sort of finding deeper meanings in law. That's a positivist is someone who's very interested in what the exact words texts say in a law. An anti-positivist is someone who, in some way or other, says, let's just do what's right, whatever the formal legal text is. And Schmitt was an anti-positivist. He started to really have an influence on politics in the years before Hitler came to power. When I was talking about the establishment people who were starting to think about using Article 48 as a vehicle to sort of overcome the democracy starting in the late 1920s. It was actually Carl Schmitt who was really the theorist of that, who sort of wrote about how the emergency powers could be used to essentially create a very different legal regime. And he wrote very famously about, he said, it's the emergency that defines the whole system. Like who has the power in the emergency? Like that's where the power is, and that's what defines the system. Um, he was able to sort of smoothly transition to the Nazis when they came in, although he hadn't been a Nazi prior to that. But they fit with his authoritarianism. And so then for a few years, he was a quite influential legal spokesperson in Nazi Germany. He was able to vent his anti-Semitism quite a bit more. And he got very interested in international law and defining ways in which the Nazis could think legally about creating the kind of empire that Hitler wanted to create for economic reasons. Although he then fell out with the Nazis around 1936, so just a few years in, the Nazis sort of lost enthusiasm for him, and he became a somewhat marginal figure after that in the regime. He went on to have a long career, though. He lived, I think, until 1985 or so. He lived a long time. Um, uh, he's had a revival. Well, he's had several revivals over the years, but he's had a revival recently on the American right. Some folks may be familiar with Project 2025, which was the Heritage Foundation document, which is sort of the playbook for Trump's second term. And Carl Schmitt is all over Project 2025, sometimes expressly invoked, sometimes just kind of in spirit behind a lot of the ideas they talk about. So there's been this real resurrection of some of his basically authoritarian, um, interested in the emergency power possibilities, sort of way of thinking about law and politics.
Um, Yeah, I think most of our listeners have seen parts of or certainly heard about Project 2025, which we're not going to go into in any detail tonight. But let me talk about another parallel, sort of parallel, maybe not a parallel. I want to ask you this question between Connecticut, the United States, and again, Germany in the Nazi era. That has to do with Christianity. So, what was the presence or role of Christianity in the Nazi movement? Like many religions, Christianity gets to has been used and abused for all kinds of political and economic and social purposes. Nazism was overtly white and nationalist, but unlike, and this is where I obviously want you to correct me, unlike the contemporary U.S. right-wing movement, where Christianity is right there front and center and is being used right in the title, white Christian nationalism, and many of the leaders they refer to God and the Bible and Jesus and things like that. That I don't think, and I again correct me if I'm wrong, that Hitler or some of his ideologues, Goebbels or others, made those kind of references. George Moss, who of course you know well as a historian, for viewers who famously argued, has a book about this theory of fascism, and he argues that Nazism had a liturgy. I'm going to just quote from him for a second: that borrowed liberally from that of the Christian churches with the martyrs, as well as its hymns, responses, and other confessions of faith in which all could join. And then Moss further states that even though Hitler used some Christian vocabulary, he pulled out all the Christian content from the vocabulary and kind of used the form, the structure of the language and the behavior. So that's, to me, is a difference between what we see today in the US and what we saw in Germany. But I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the role of Christianity in the Nazi movement and the parallels to today, or lack thereof.
So that's an issue that's about as controversial maybe as the Reichstag fire. Historians debate quite a lot how congruent or not congruent Nazism was with especially German Christianity, especially German Lutheranism. Um, so just as I feel as a matter of full disclosure, I should say this is a big controversy. That said, I'll say what I think. Um, you're absolutely right. Hitler and his inner circle, almost all of them were lapsed Catholics. It's a sort of well-known experience that there's no anti-clerical quite like a lapsed Catholic. And they were all like militantly anti-Christian. Like they had nothing but contempt for the Christian religion. Largely because of all that, blessed are the meek stuff. That's not a particularly Nazi-friendly message. It also didn't help. I mean, they had a lot of problems with this that, the deity of the religion to which 99% of Germans theoretically subscribed was Jewish. So if you're a Nazi, that's a problem too. So they sort of tried, somewhat half-heartedly, to create a branch within the German Lutheran Church, which was expressly called the German Christians, which was supposed to create a kind of Nazi version of Christianity, including downplaying or denying that Christ was Jewish. Like they somehow wanted to claim, no, Christ was an Aryan. They said pastors should be stormtroopers of Christ, and they're sort of trying to make this, rather violent Nazi faith out of it. There were plenty of Christians of both Catholic and Protestant varieties who felt that Nazism was an utter abomination from a Christian standpoint. To me, that is much more plausible. Uh, you may have noticed the epigraph for my book, The Death of Democracy, comes from the book of Matthew,
I did see
um,
that. Yeah.
which articulates a moral principle which I think is absolutely unimpeachable. I mean, in the book of Matthew, Christ basically says, if you follow me, you need to go to the most vulnerable, you need to give food to the hungry and water to the thirsty, and you need to comfort prisoners. And when such a person comes to you, I come to you. And you must treat that person as if it were me. And I think if a person comes to you who's suffering, and if you treat the people who come to you as you would treat Christ, you can't go very wrong morally. But that's a very not Nazi way to address the world, and that's partly why the Nazis had only contempt for Christianity, and it's partly why some of the famous anti-Nazi resistance figures, like the pastor Martin Niemöller or the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were people whose Christianity led them into resistance. So that's my relatively quick take on your question.
No, it's very helpful to have that. So we have a couple of questions that have come into the chat, And let me just ask them now. So one is, why is there a rise in the number of young men as neo-Nazis in Germany today? At the same time, ultra-conservative young men as neo-Nazis in the US. What is precipitating this?
My guess, and I should say that I think that exceeds my expertise as a historian and as an old guy too. It exceeds my expertise, but my guess, for what it's worth, is that it's not really the ideological content; it's more the taboo factor. And I think, young people, and I think especially young men, often want to sort of be on, have a kind of outsider vibe and sort of stick up a middle finger to society. And one way to do that in our culture here in the United States, or certainly, very certainly in Germany, is to espouse Nazism, to use the symbols, to use the vocabulary, to, say in a text chain, "I love Hitler," as has happened. So I think it has more to do with the taboo and shock value than any actual, I don't know, probably even understanding, let alone sympathy with the ideology. Although I'm sure people who are doing that probably do have racist views that they feel are congruent with this. But I strongly suspect that people doing this don't know anything about Nazism. I doubt they have spent a lot of time. I don't see them in my classes, let me put it that way.
Mhm. Well, I suspect that, I mean, maybe these folks do know about this white replacement theory, which obviously was talked about in some form or another back in the Nazi period as well, right? That whites are being eliminated from their, from the world. We need to kill everybody else so we don't before they kill us. Let's kill them. So and that certainly is very prevalent today, actually in Germany and other parts of Europe, and certainly in the United States. And so they do subscribe, even if they don't understand what that actually means and how impossible that theory even could be to be realized, do believe that is the case. That we white people are being replaced in some way intentionally by Democrats and whomever, and it's totally absurd, but yet people still believe this.
The Nazis were, by the way, only in a very qualified sense white supremacists. Um, Virtually all of their victims were people we would deem to be white in the United States, European Jews, Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe, and so on. Their allies were the Japanese, and to some extent, their allies were Arabs in the Middle East too. And towards the end of the war, they were looking to make use of an Indian division to fight the British. I mean, they on some level they sort of were white supremacists, but they really had other priorities in terms of their racial thinking. I would put it that way.
Mhm. Let me ask you another question about the United States. So, one of the most troubling series of events unfolding right in front of our eyes right now is the development and the repurposing of mass detention centers, for incarcerated individuals rounded up by ICE, ostensibly because they're in the U.S. without the proper paperwork. Of course, we know that many of these folks actually do have the paperwork. Some they're either here legally, some are actually in the process of getting asylum or applying for asylum and green cards, actually taken from a courthouse, doing the legal thing, and yet they were still taken and put in these camps. Um, but regardless of why they were there, so it's very concerning that these centers exist as they do. It's concerning that they're not subject to public scrutiny. So we don't really know who's there. We don't know why they're there. We can't talk to those individuals there. We can't go and see what's happening there. We do hear that there are deplorable conditions with food and medical care and so on. So, and I hear people now talking about, well, these are the American concentration camps. This is the American gulag happening now. And clearly these are not death camps. These are not extermination camps, but there are camps that were concentration camps that didn't, at least early on, weren't death camps in Germany. So, what do you make of this comparison? Do you think that's a fair one to make? And actually, before I say that, I'm going to make a plug in for our next conversation, which is that in May, I'm going to be speaking with Brianna Nofil. And Brianna Nofil is an historian at William and Mary who wrote a book on incarceration and immigration in the United States history. So this is sort of, I want to get your take as a German specialist on this question. I'm going to be talking to her about her take as an American historian in a few weeks. But go ahead, please.
So I think I want to walk a bit of a middle ground on this question. Um, I think these ICE detention centers are deplorable. And I actually hope that when this administration is finally gone, we have some equivalent of a denazification or a Nuremberg proceeding, because I think there are people who need to be brought to justice and face consequences for what they're doing to people in these situations. That said, I think it would fall under the category of being a little hysterical to liken them too closely to a Nazi concentration camp. Even, I mean, as you said, um, a concentration camp was not the same thing as a death camp. Those were actually separate institutions. And especially in the earlier years, Nazi concentration camps were places where you would basically be sent if you were a deemed political opponent of the Nazis. But even those early camps, as far as I know, I mean, because you're right, we don't have a lot of insight into what happens in these ICE facilities. But as far as I know, still, from everything I do know, from what I've read, they're not nearly as brutal as even an early Nazi concentration camp, where people were quite routinely tortured and beaten. And so, as awful as these facilities, I'm sure, are, I, I think it's a little bit verging on irresponsible to say that that's the same as Dachau in 1933 or something like that.
Hmm. Um, yeah, that's interesting. That's good to have your perspective on that question. Another question from the audience is Trump has a real abhorrence for judges and the judiciary. How did Hitler treat the German judiciary?
Oh, exactly the same, actually. That's definitely a
That's not what you're
rhyme.
going to say. Yeah.
That's a rhyme in the Mark Twain sense. Absolutely. Hitler had nothing but contempt for lawyers. Um, and judges. There are famous instances in records of him speaking where we have him venting about how useless he thinks judges and lawyers are. I think you could probably line up quotes from Hitler and Trump speaking about judges, and you would be hard pressed to tell who was whom if they weren't identified, by speaker. Um, uh, the difference is that German judges were vastly more deferential to Hitler than American judges have been to Trump, at least up until this point. Um, in a way, German judges had an almost kind of unrequited love affair with Trump. They sort of wanted to, on the whole, they were a very right-wing bunch, and they wanted to kind of be on his side, but they could never quite make it because they couldn't quite abandon their training as people who thought about law and the rule of law, and they couldn't quite get to a Nazi position. I mean, the Nazis were absolutely hostile to any law, including their own. They always talked about reforming the Constitution and reforming the criminal code and reforming the civil code, and they never actually did. They never got around to it because they actually didn't even want their own law. They wanted to just be able to sort of do what they wanted in the moment.
Um, and didn't Hitler end up replacing a lot of the judges as well?
No, basically not. I
Um,
mean, if he replaced or fired and replaced the ones who were deemed to be Jewish or the very, very few who were politically liberal or left-leaning, but there weren't many of those, even in 1933. No, by and large, the judiciary that was there in the Weimar Republic sailed right on through. In fact, this is something I've done a lot of research on. There are plenty of judges and prosecutors and private lawyers too, who started their career in Weimar and are still going in the 50s or 60s in West Germany. Is just a straight on continuity.
that's actually scarier than if he had actually replaced the judges. That
Yes,
they actually became so enthralled with him.
German judges of the Weimar Republic do not get a good press from historians. They are often seen as a kind of, authoritarian fifth column in the state, and so they adapted quite well to Hitler on the whole.
So I have two questions that are related to each other and related to resistance. I'm going to read one fairly, it's a little longer, but there's an intro, then there's an actual question associated with that. So this is a quote now. So your work shows how effectively wealthy elites in 1933 as today, exploit many citizens' painful sense of humiliation to garner a plurality of populist voters to back the leader. So scary then, scary now. The more hopeful difference you depict, however, between Germany of then and the U.S. of now may emerge most importantly around the eager willingness of Americans to express their outrage against the leader, as you've already talked about, Ben, in large demonstrations and in Minneapolis for sure. The question that this person asks is this: how might history suggest that we lever and capitalize on that sort of outrage, fuel demonstration and other action. It is in no way uniquely American. I mean, think about what happened in South Korea when the South Korean president wanted to, try to declare martial law. So it's happened there as well. But I guess how can we leverage this stuff and actually maybe have more of an impact and slow down what's happening in Washington?
Um, well, I think the answer is to emulate the people who have had good results on pushing back on Trump. And there have been several, I think, sort of categories or groups that have done that. I think we all owe an enormous debt to the people of Minneapolis who were in the trenches, so to speak, for a couple of months there, I think. And I'm fascinated by the sort of grassroots, spontaneous organization that sprung up there and the way they would sort of track ICE cars going out and sort of keep tabs on where they were and kind of get in their face. And I mean, obviously, it led to some tragic outcomes with a couple of people who got shot, um, but at least it speaks to something I've always thought was there, and I think it is there now, which is a kind of organic resistance by at least a lot of Americans, if not all Americans, to this kind of overt authoritarianism. I think the law firms who refused to knuckle under to Trump, sort of a year ago, especially when this was becoming a big thing, they showed a bit of the way. Like, stick to your principles, fight for the rule of law, don't cave. The law firms that caved, I think, have good reason to be ashamed of themselves. Kind of the same with universities.
Yeah.
I'm a proud graduate of Harvard. I'm glad that Harvard has kind of pushed back on a lot of what the Trump administration has been asking them to do. I think it's regrettable that some universities have given in to his demands on, diversity and other things like that. So I think the thing to do is just all of us, there's something all of us can do, whatever it may be. I'm going to be at the No Kings thing on Saturday. I speak a lot in forums like this. I try to speak up and say things about democracy. We all have to get on it. I mean, democracy is not a spectator sport. Call your Congress people and your senators, call them all the time, get in their face, no matter what party they are, get in their face, like be heard. I've heard from many, many, many lawmakers that matters, that they take calls to their office very seriously. Get out on the street if that's your thing. Join a group, like join a volunteer organization if you have the time. Join an organization that supports migrants, or get involved in a political campaign, or all of this, like whatever it is. It almost doesn't matter what it is, but as long as we're all doing something, I think we'll be fine.
So we're near the end of our hour. I wanted to ask you about your current work. So you're working on a book on criminal profile or criminal, is it profiling, or at least criminal policing,
Or
sorry,
criminal
in Germany.
policing more broadly,
So
yeah.
can you tell us more about what the project is and when are we going to see it in the bookstores?
Sure. If you ask a professor what they're writing about, they will tell you.
Yes.
Um, there's a kind of surface story and there's a deeper meaning. The surface story is the book is about a serial killer who was operating in Berlin in 1940 and 41, who killed women by throwing them off commuter trains in Berlin. The commuter trains are called the S-Bahn. And so this guy became known as the S-Bahn killer, and he murdered five women by throwing them off trains. He threw two more women off trains that survived, and he also murdered three women in a sort of cottage settlement near the train tracks by stabbing or beating them. So between the fall of 1940 and July of 1941, the Berlin police put on the biggest investigation in their history to try and catch this guy. And they did finally catch him. Um, the bigger story that this is really getting at is that on one level, it would seem, or I should say that the higher officers of the Berlin police, the higher echelons of the command, as they were looking for this serial killer, the same people were literally planning the Holocaust. So it seems like a bit of a paradox that you would be working to catch what I call a private sector killer, but meanwhile, you are making yourself the biggest public sector killer in history. That seems like a paradox. But then the kind of really big point of the book is it's actually not a paradox because of the way that the Nazis thought about criminal policing and criminal justice. And basically, they thought about criminals as a racial group. They drew on theories that had been around before the Nazis, but the Nazis drew on them that really racialized criminals and said the habitual criminal is part of a distinct race, which is kind of a throwback to a primitive human race. And what the criminal police need to do is identify the criminal, identify the racial attributes of the criminal and detain them and ultimately kill them. So basically, the Nazi criminal police are coming up with a model of identifying a racial group and detaining them and killing them. And this is well before the Holocaust that they're doing this. So the sort of really big point of the book is that the Holocaust, as it emerges during World War II, is actually a model that starts with the criminal police being applied to criminals, and then it gets grafted onto other groups, kind of sequentially. That model gets grafted onto people with physical and mental handicaps, and it gets grafted onto the Sinti and Roma, used to be called the Gypsies, and it finally gets grafted onto Jews, and that's kind of a major root of the Holocaust. So that's basically the story the book tells. It is, as far as I know, last I heard from my publisher, I'm sort of finishing the draft now. It will be published by Basic Books, I think early in 2027. That's my expectation.
Okay, well, I'll look for that. So I always ask my guests one question about if you were to recommend a book or two to audience members who want to learn either more about Nazi Germany or maybe about fascism. And in fact, I wanted to ask you about fascism tonight, but just we ran out of time. So we're not going to be able to get to that question as to what it is, what isn't it, what are all the ways to define it, because there are so many out there, various forms and so on. So we can't get to that. But if a reader or an audience member wanted to read more about fascism and or Nazi Germany, what are a couple of books that you might recommend besides your own, which of course I recommend your books. I'll do that for you. I recommend your books very highly. Besides
And
your
thank
own
you.
books, what might you recommend?
Sure. I mean, I could be here all day with that, but I'll give you a quick answer. So on fascism, actually, there's a vast literature on what fascism is, and there are many different answers to that question. But the one that I really like and would recommend is a book called The Anatomy of Fascism by the really brilliant Columbia historian Robert Paxton. Came out about 20 years
I
ago.
read that book too. I love
Yeah,
that book.
fantastic. I think Paxton
Yeah.
is just absolutely brilliant, and I think that's a fantastic book. And I buy his definition of fascism. I think he's got it right. There's a book that really affected my thinking by my friend Peter Fritzsche, who's a professor in Illinois. He wrote a book called Germans into Nazis, which Peter has an incredible gift to write very succinctly, but to make really interesting points. And his book, his quite short book, gives an explanation of where Nazism comes from and why it succeeds politically. And I think it's really brilliant. And then let me just recommend one more. And I'll recommend this partly because it's brilliant and partly because I'm going to be doing an event with the author next week. So there's a book that's just come out in English. It was originally written in German. In English, it's called People Without History Are Dust. It's by the brilliant Czech English historian Anna Hajková. And Anna's book is about bringing basically LGBTQ history into the history of the Holocaust. And what I think is really fascinating about her work is she shows how there are really blind spots in history, and there are ways in which our narratives of what happened in the Holocaust sort of leave out, very deliberately often leave out the experiences of LGBTQ people and how the story changes if you bring that narrative back in. For instance, a lot of people don't know this. There's some passages in famous Anna Frank's diary where Anna Frank is talking about how she's really sexually attracted to a girl that she knows, and those passages tend to get forgotten, but it's part of the story. It's part of understanding the whole thing, and I find that really fascinating.
Well, thank you for those. I'll have to. I have the Paxton book, which I've read, but the other two I don't have, and I'll have to track those down and read those as well. So let me thank you again, Ben, for taking your time tonight. This has been really interesting to me. I'm sure your time is very valuable, especially when you're working on, your articles and teaching classes and grading and all the stuff that you're doing as an academic. And your perspectives are, of course, very, very insightful and helpful. The conversation has been enjoyable to me. I'm sure the audience has felt the same way. So thanks again for coming to us. And I want to thank the Mark Twain Library and our Grand League of Women Voters, and hand the microphone back to Marianne.
On behalf of all sponsors and supporters who made this program possible, we extend our deepest thanks to Benjamin Hett and Dan Barrett for joining us this evening. And it is with gratitude that we thank the staff and volunteers of the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters for making this production possible. This evening's conversation will be just as enlightening in reruns, so don't forget to spread the word about the library's YouTube channel. And of course, thanks to all who joined us here this evening. Good night.
Yes, thank you all. Good night. Good night, Ben.